Yeah. So welcome to the second in the conversation, city design and conversation, in this second series dedicated to the questions of minor planning. My name is Dubravka Sekulic. I'm a program lead for MA City Design and someone who is also trying to think through this idea of the minor planning. Within city design, we are developing justice-centered pedagogy, which aims at equipping students with skills to redefine what the new approaches to urban and city design can be, that respond to the immense transformation that societies have undergone in the past couple of decades, and that this transformation is accelerating. And this is also happening under the ongoing environmental and social crisis. By placing those who are the most oppressed and invisibilized by the current real estate logic-driven master plan approach to the urban design, which often prioritizes demolition and formal resolution, settler colonialism, and hostile environment policy regimes. A new approaches to city design, students develop projects which work across scales and bridge institutional, policy, and spatial design, and create new imaginaries which aim at articulating what a new approach can be, or new approaches can be. There is always more than one approach. Situated a holistic and an emancipatory approach to how the cities and how the built environment can be transformed. We call this minor planning. And in this series of conversations, we are honored to talk with those whose practices inform how we think about minor planning, and to also who help us also to kind of push forward this idea that it's not about being prescriptive and one way of doing it, but it is really about recognizing what are the inherent dispositions that exist already within the existing spatial configurations or communities, and how to use design across its many manifestations, which is both shaping physical space, but also shaping it invisibly through policies, campaigning, activism, various sorts, to nurture equitable life in the built environment. So I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with Olympia, whose work has been helping me think through some of these things, and who I have met many, many, many moons ago, and has been always one of those people who's a kind of incredible energy I have really appreciated, but also helping me understand that there are many, many ways to practice and make an intervention. Her official bio says that Olympia Kazi is an architecture critic and an urban activist with over 20 years of experience in advocacy, research, curating, and administration of cultural and urban design organizations in Europe and the United States. And that she recently led successful city, state, and federal legislative and budgetary advocacy campaigns with two organizations she co-founded, New York City Arts Coalition and Music versus Workers Alliances. And in recognition of her work, she served as a vice chair of the first ever New York City Nightlife Advisory Board. And she also served on Manhattan's Community Board 3 on land use and zoning and arts and cultural affairs. And what you've already seen Olympia's bio are all these very kind of serious words that frame to a lot of kind of what we are trained in the conventional architecture to think as boring, but actually are really important sides of intervention. So I'm really kind of interested in kind of hearing it, really excited about this conversation. So how will it work today? Olympia will give a short presentation and overview of the things she's been working and engaging with and doing, and then we will have a conversation, and then we will have a Q&A. But please feel free to type your questions as we go along as well. I will pop in some links which are related to the previous conversation in the series, and also the series continues next Thursday, so I will tell you about this later. So Olympia, thank you so much for doing this with me, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning from New York. I'm having my first coffee of the day, so you can blame it on that if I'm not, as interesting as this great introduction has set up your expectations to be. So I'm gonna walk you through how I started, because I did study architecture, and all the way to today, and if there is any logic to what I will be presenting, believe me, it was not planned. It just happened. And I really hope that you will submit some questions, because I look forward to discussing with you the kind of things that ended up shaping what I'm doing today, and the fights, the very much needed fights about, urbanism today. So I studied architecture back in the late 90s. And ever since I was a student, I was drawn to something that was emerging back then. It was interdisciplinary practice. I was calling it art, architecture, activism, new forms of engagement in the public sphere. There were a lot of these kind of projects, especially, oh, by the way, what Dubravka and I also share is we're both Balkan girls. And so,
Olympia, do you want to share the slides already, or?
oh, sorry, I'm sharing them, so
No.
you cannot see them?
No.
Can the people see it? Because here it says your screen is sharing and that I haven't stopped. Do you want to ask the people in the audience if they can see it?
Okay, so that's just me on them. Sorry.
Okay. Perfect. And so, I was very interested in the way these different kind of practices that maybe don't represent what somebody's traditional idea of architecture and planning is, how they were, coming to be, the kind of areas of interest that they were having. And I started my career, I studied in Italy, in Florence, in the architecture school. And then I worked in the Triennale di Milano. But very quickly, in around 2004, 2005, I moved in the US. And the right part of my side, you see the Village Voice, and it's about biking. And I had at the time a fellowship at the Independent Study Program of the Whitney. And it was a critical studies fellowship, and in basically urban issues, and I decided to focus on critical mass. That is a biking movement. It occurred every Friday. And, I don't know, today maybe we all are used to have bike share programs. We all are used to have bike lanes, etc. But, there were moments in which biking was considered radical and had become the center of contentious attention. Anyhow, these were the kind of things that I was interested while I was beginning, let's say, my career. And I ended up working in research institutes, and I became the director of first the Institute for Urban Design. And now we are moving forward to 2007, Earth Day 2007. Then Mayor Bloomberg announced Plan YC. It was a sustainability, let's say, plan. And it was focusing on how do we grow the city, how do we reduce emissions, how do we improve infrastructure, and what happens to the quality of life. So it was a very ambitious blueprint. And frankly, like often happened at that time, and maybe still does, there was, the voice of architects and planners I had found to be, or design actually, was basically missing. All the planning was done with a lot of great experts, but the traditional, let's say, knowledge and approach of design wasn't there. So we decided to contribute that. I must say that I was blessed because I was the director of this tiny institute, but in my board, it was my mentor, Michael Sorkin, and we had people like Saskia Sassen and Tom Main. So there was a lot of very interesting people involved in that project, and we invited an incredible amount of responders to that plan. And this project was the first, let's say, for me, as someone who was coming first from traditional architecture training, and then from a place of research and academia and critical studies, to how do we actually shape the built environment, right? What does it take? What does government do? How does the funding work? How does the legislation work? What is the process, right? And how do we have a stake? And is there, like, what is the most meaningful way in which designers can contribute in these processes? So move forward a few more years, and now I'm at a bigger institute, Van Allen Institute, and we continue to think and work through issues of public design, public space, design excellence. And this was something that I had felt, in all my career earlier on in Europe too. But I think once I was in the US, because of the way the specialization of professions work, I felt that it was even, the design approach was even more marginalized. And so we had some incredible opportunities to contribute and bring this perspective in projects that were, I guess, deemed too big for architects. So the leading firms would always be engineers or, what are the developers, And so I chose to share those two little projects because one of them was, it's called Project Eco Delta, and it was a partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, and it was focusing on the lower Mississippi River Delta. That is a very, very interesting, site. The Mississippi River, is basically one of the biggest infrastructures of the US, the amount of goods and services that run through that. In fact, guess who's maintaining it? The military. It's the Army Corps of Engineers. And for that project, I had the pleasure, for the one and only time in my life, to be in the Pentagon and meet with generals who, basically had ultimately the power and the responsibility to make sure that this infrastructure functions. And there were a lot of conversation that I guess it's still ongoing around adaptation and mitigation, right? So how much do we accept what nature does, and how much, do we respond to that, and do we shape that or try to shape that? And it was interesting because it continues to have an interdisciplinary approach, but fundamentally it is trying to understand what can we contribute, especially in that side. Don't forget Katrina and climate change, etc. So we are talking about issues. Yes, it starts as it's infrastructure. It's a lot of geographical, political, economical, but very much social, history. I didn't mean to say that, but there is a crazy book, if anybody is interested, called Rising Tide, and it talks about the history of how that infrastructure was maintained. And part of it is at a certain point, they would use, when the river would rise, they would use human bodies as levees to protect the people. That is crazy. And not just human bodies, by the way, slaves. So it was like truly horrific. The second project is more lighthearted, but very interesting as well. It was a collaboration with the National Park Service. The National Park Service was in crisis, and they felt that there were their visitorship was dwindling, and especially younger people were not engaged, and they would not, they wanted to say, we're tired of having NPR listeners and Birkenstock wearers be the only visitors with gray-haired NPR listeners and Birkenstock wearers be the only visitors of the parks. So we took the parks to the youth, and we coordinated a student competition across, I don't remember if it was like 8 schools of architecture. And we opened the conversation of how do we basically facilitate the engagement of visitors and, the special experiences that, of course, there is this gorgeous nature, and it can be, appealing, but also overwhelming. And also as don't forget, we're talking about projects that are at this point 15 years old or something, maybe a bit less. So there was also the beginning of the digital world that was dominating, especially, the younger people. Anyhow, I don't want to dwell too much in the past and the origins, but I feel that with these slides, you see uh, my work when it was more within the field of, architecture planning, urban design, in a more, let's say, traditional way. And this project is, when I was at Van Allen, we really wanted to engage with the public because, as you can imagine, very often when you work on this kind of infrastructure, major projects, it ends up being that you work, again, like within we speak to each other, like the engineers with the architects, with the decision makers, and the idea was, how do we include the public? So we created this storefront presence. This project, do I have it down here? Yeah, 2011 it was open, this space. It was 2011 to 2014. It was designed by Lotec, and we at the time in New York, and still to this day, like, we didn't have an architecture bookstore. Everything had closed, and we opened this space and became right away a huge success of events, people constantly coming, talking to each other, talking about new books. Many interesting conversations happened in that space. And it was also very interesting because finally we had encounters with the, general public, right? And I want to stop here and say that, so we kind of gone through what were the issues that me, when I was in your shoes, studying architecture and then practicing architecture in the beginning, as someone who had this view of, wanting to frankly change the world and improve it. That is, you have to be ambitious when you're young, at least. I was working with many interesting people on many interesting issues. And frankly, there was little interest from the public in general, right? I felt that a lot of the architecture design world was pretty relevant other than to ourselves. And in some ways that was fair, frankly, because we don't always do the work to become relevant, right? Because you do need real research. You do need an understanding of the complex dynamics that shape the urban space, right? And the cities, and the process of building and developing and managing those spaces, that I think very often the design field maybe naively thinks that has all the answers, and we don't. But what we are very good at doing, I think, is having the questions. And so I wrote those 3 very simple questions because I would do a lot of like forums and lectures and whatever back in the day. And I would say to everybody, because I presented about public housing and public space, etc., I was like, I wanted to unpack this idea of public. So who is public? And I would ask always the audience, I'm sorry today you guys cannot answer the question, but it was like, it's very likely when I ask you to think about the public, that you think about you, that you think about your ideas or your priorities or your needs. And now I want you to vision the person that you kind of hate the most, that you disagree with them all the time, that you find them annoying or obnoxious. And guess what? It is very likely that that person represents the public much more than you do. And so once we understand that, every time we talk about public space or public housing or community, or how do we engage community, or participatory process and how do they come part of that. These were all issues that were part of each and every project I've always been involved in. And I felt that, those are questions that are very hard to answer and are still relevant. And I think as designers, we need to keep thinking about them and checking our work every time with these. At least for me, these are like very important questions that you need to always have in your mind. So as I'm starting now to bring you more into the nitty-gritty of actual legislation and advocacy and the kind of things that I ended up doing, one of the answers to my question around, okay, how do we really shape the built environment? How do we bring the public in? There is a infrastructure in local government, especially in the US, in New York City. What you see here is the map of community districts in the city. So basically, we have community boards. These are citizens that are interviewed by our elected representatives, our council members, and they asked every little number that you see here. Like I was serving at Community Board 3 in Manhattan. The red Manhattan is the red island there. In the bottom right, you see number 3. Imagine this is a neighborhood, but it's a neighborhood of 50,000 people. See, it's as if it's a town, basically. And that's where I started serving at land use and zoning and at arts and cultural affairs. And the role of this board is advisory, but it doesn't have resources so much, but it does have a lot of on the ground understanding of what is happening in the neighborhood that very often decision makers don't have. And thanks to the effort of, elected officials and advocates over the years, the community board where I was serving, it was a truly diverse space. I think this is so important when we are talking about basically designing, resolving a problem in the urban space, right? So understanding all these perspectives of different ages, different incomes, different level of education. Do you have kids? Do you have mobility issues? Do you have traffic issues? Where do you live? Do you have a home? These were all voices that were actually represented in that community board. And believe it or not, thanks to the Roberts rules and a lot of, hours of difficult meetings and conversations, we were effective in contributing feedback on issues. At the time that I was there, we dealt with the East Side Coastal Resiliency Plan. As we were talking earlier about climate change, New York floods, we had Irene, we had Sandy. The East River that you can see is basically one big side of Community Board 3, came in and flooded a big part of our district. And this was a major infrastructure project. And we did other ones, 2 bridges I want to mention, the jails I want to mention. But what I want to say is when we were reviewing these projects through a process that is called ULERP, we often had architects and designers presenting. And when I joined the community board, I thought, my role can be that of a bridge, and I can explain and help educate. And I found myself siding with the community against the architects most of the time, because the reality was, the kind of architects that we would get, they were hired guns from actors that, let's say, didn't have the best quality of space or built environment as their priority. Their priority was to satisfy whoever hired them. And also just to be fair to the architects, not all of them were terrible, though many were. And I can give names on another lecture. But it was also interesting to see that because we haven't been at the socio-political level able to advance the right kind of protections around development, especially in the city of New York. Very often, the better quality of space, public space, or even infrastructure or design, like housing, parks, streets, were seen from the community as tools of displacement. So it was not, gentrification doesn't start as a negative thing, but very often implicates displacement either on the first degree, or what I learned through my endless hours of doing this kind of plans and analysis, and secondary displacement. And so that means that, when everything is changing around you, eventually, even though they don't kick you out, you have to move out. And I'll talk a bit more about that. So now we're getting into the thick of it. This is a tragedy. 36 people died there. This was about 9 years ago, December 2nd, 2016. It's in Auckland, and this warehouse is Gossip. This was a DIY space. And DIY spaces, if you don't know about them, they're usually basically community-driven spaces, venues, where usually artists, musicians, and all sorts of people who are seeking alternative community and alternative culture meet, often live. And they're not up to code. Usually they're not, conforming. And when this tragedy happened in 2016, the city of New York was undergoing, now we had de Blasio as our mayor, and the Department of Cultural Affairs was doing a plan for the first time. So in the US, the funding for arts and culture is not as centralized as, we have in many European countries with ministries and subsidies, etc. So we have a small, budget at the National Endowment for the Arts federally, but in the city of New York, the Department of Cultural Affairs just alone has, I think, a bigger budget than the National Endowment for the Arts. And so the idea was for a progressive mayor who was elected on the story of the city of Two Tails City. What was it called? The city of Two Tails. They were trying to use an equity lens and understand of how do we plan about arts and culture in a way that is more inclusive. And so it wanted to create a sustainable environment for arts and culture. They wanted to support local artists, and of course, communities, community engagement. That's the key word since the beginning of my interest. And so here it's me and many other people. Just 2 weeks after the tragedy, if I'm not mistaken, this was a January meeting in 2017. And the guy you see in the middle standing is the commissioner for the Department of Cultural Affairs. And this meeting was convened around DIY spaces. And so in Brooklyn at the time, there was a thriving ecosystem of many, many DIY spaces. Most of them underground, but, networked. And also, don't forget, this is the first Trump term. And there was a lot of, fear and people after the Gossip tragedy felt that law enforcement was moving in, trying to shuttle these spaces. At the same time, as I said, there was a huge affordability crisis. That's why Mayor de Blasio was elected with the story of Two Tails. City of Two Tails. I don't remember his slogan, but you understand the story of basically we have in this the wealthiest city in the planet, and here we have like the worst kind of homelessness and affordability crisis over every kind of facet of the life of New Yorkers. So after this meeting, I attended it, and frankly, I may have been the only person from the architecture world and planning world who was in the room. The majority of these people were artists, musicians, operators of spaces, all sorts of cultural adjacent, curators, etc. And the group of people who convened uh, connected. It had already connected online. That, by the way, I have a limited presence, so I didn't follow that stuff. But in IRL, in that room, we all formally convened and decided that we needed to make our voices heard. So this issue of how do we have community spaces, areas where arts and culture can thrive both in terms of who wants to make them, but also in terms of who wants to access them, right? Because when we're talking about an affordability crisis, if you are raising children in the city, you can't afford to go to a museum. Like, at least you guys over there have free museums. Like, for us, even the museums, over the years, many of them try to make it more affordable or free for at least the children. But you know what I mean. It is just ridiculous how all of these things are commodified and rendered exclusive. And frankly, it is also to the detriment of the quality of the culture that we get once it is, insular and not accessible. So all this group of various people from various walks of life ended up meeting, convening, and reconvening. We created this vague umbrella of New York City Artists Coalition, and we decided that in order for us to understand how do we keep this kind of spaces, DIY spaces, safe, but also vibrant and thriving and safe, not just from the perspective of the structure, right? But also the perspective of, community. Because a lot of the people who are in those spaces are, live alternative lives, or are people who have need of care, harm reduction, people who are exposed to all sorts of difficult challenges in their life. So I ended up, without knowing why or how, being the person who collected the input from everybody and became the bridge of how do we bring this finally the voice of the public. Like, we would do events in the places where I was before and nobody would show up. And now, or it would be the usual suspect showing up, and we would preach to the choir in the echo chamber. And now we had, hundreds of people giving input from many different perspectives. And the question then became, how do we translate this polyphony into something that is enactable and can actually yield answers to the needs that were pressing? Now, what is crazy is we ended up having, hundreds of ideas, but they landed all under three umbrellas. The first one was affordability. So stopping displacement by tackling affordability. Then the second one was when you have these informal kind of spaces, but then you have this super formal government, right? How do you allow these spaces to access support so that they can be in compliance with building code or fire code, so that they can have, permits that are designed for corporations and they're super expensive or require you to hire 10 consultants. And then, of course, last but not least, prevent criminalization. Alternative, spaces, alternative lives always attract discrimination. And how do we protect those? Because these are the areas where new ideas start. These are the areas where the most interesting projects, I think, take root. And with this kind of agenda, we basically started convening. This project. This is called the Secret Robot Project. This space doesn't exist anymore. It was one of the DIY spaces. One of the most famous spaces that was started at that time in New York was Silent Barn. So a lot of the people who were running those spaces were part of the New York City Artists Coalition. And because of our advocacy, we created an agenda of, concrete ways in which the government could help us. And once we had our clear agenda, this space was called Market Hotel. And you see again the usual commissioner of the Department of Cultural Affairs, Curtis Blow, the granddad of hip hop, but also you see here council members, borough president, the woman on the right with the black jacket and gray dress is our incoming speaker right now, Julie Manning. She's the presumptive speaker. So we breathed, so the people behind, like in the room, are all sorts of like artists, nightlife goers, entrepreneurs, micro business, kitchen, alternative artwork, so like any kind of interesting thing that is happening in the neighborhoods, right, where that people do access. Those kind of people were needed help. And with this agenda, we were able to bring their voices in the decision-making table and actually change stuff. So the first legislation we passed was the establishment of the Office of Nightlife. And that was one of the ways that we felt these spaces could be helped is if they had a dedicated office that would have a better understanding of how all these things come together, from fire safety to programming to access to healthcare services, victims of, violence or drugs, or like there were a lot of things that were all overlapping in these spaces, good and bad, and they were not easy from individual agencies to be able to understand and cross-reference. And then the second thing that became the focus of our attention was, how do you decriminalize? So a lot of these spaces, of course, being areas where there was music, there was dancing. And the New York Police Department would very often use a scare tactic to invade these spaces by saying, oh, you're dancing without a permit. Because in New York, we still had a prohibition-era legislation called cabaret law that required you to go through a very expensive permitting process and pay a lot in order for you to have this permit. And there were also zoning restrictions about where you could do that kind of dancing. And so, of course, for us, it became, first of all, we do not want anybody to be able to use this in a discriminatory way. That is, I use it in this neighborhood because I don't like these folks. They're too dark-skinned, too gay, or to whatever. And then I don't use it in that area because they're whatever, hipsters. So the idea was that we were able to prove both white was problematic and not okay, but also there was an argument that had been made over decades, but somehow was falling on deaf ears, that dancing is an expression, is free speech. Like, you cannot regiment my expression by saying, oh, the zoning doesn't allow you to shake your booty here. It's like that. Sorry, that wasn't good. So we unexpectedly first were told, you can't do that, you can't repeal it. We had to have an oversight hearing. We had to learn the ropes of how government works and how do you advocate and how do you pass from a hearing at the city council to another closed door meeting to whatever. But eventually the cabaret law was repealed and moved on to the second area that we were very distressed about. Some raids orchestrated by NYPD, but a lot of other agencies would come in from the Department of Health, the Department of Buildings, the Fire Department, all sorts of other agencies, city agencies would come and call, multi-agency response to community hotspots. So we did an analysis of where those raids were happening. And as you can see, there was a concentration in areas that had, of course, nightlife, but also areas where lower income, people of color would frequent more, especially like in the same neighborhood. Let's say some venues would get raided a lot of times and others not. So for us, community spaces are vital, and hotspots, community hotspots are vital. So what we need to do is preserve them. What we need to do is support them. What we need to do is help them become safer. And so we were, again, successful in passing a law. That was the third law we passed. And these things are happening, by the way, super, super fast. And that may set up the bar. Yeah, these people are doing great. But guess what? After we passed this law and we made that second, goal true, we focused on the hardest one to solve. And that was affordability. So, I mean, again, I'm just giving you the highlights. Obviously, we had a lot of other things that we were doing. I personally, in the meanwhile, had also served at the office, at the Nightlife Advisory Board. So we were dealing with many more different issues with various coalitions of people. But from the perspective of the New York City Artists Coalition, what we saw was our city escaping in front of our eyes, shattering down. And that was before the pandemic, right? So storefront after storefront shutting down, space after space shutting down, and shutting down to nothing. These were not spaces that nobody wanted to go or they were not thriving or whatever. These were just spaces that after decades that were great, a landlord could just up and say, doubling the rent, tripling the rent. There was no protection for commercial tenants, right? And so that's where the artists came in huge coalition with small businesses, with economic development advocates, etc. And we created a campaign that ended up being called Fair Rent NYC. And we talked about a common sense protection that once a space is used from an artist studio, from a venue, from a store, from anything that is, providing a meaningful service to their community and their neighborhood, they cannot be basically evicted by doubling and tripling the rent. And this legislation had been introduced, like it takes a lot of work to introduce, then it was heard before the pandemic. And it was only introduced before the pandemic and it was heard after. Anyhow, sorry. But let me take a sip of my coffee and I'm done, because for us, this bill and the fact that city leaders have been working on it since the 60s in New York City to introduce a basic protection for commercial tenants, for the people who make our city livable. Because what is a city without the neighborhood coffee shop, right? Without the place that keeps, first of all, providing us services, providing jobs. Half of the jobs in New York City are provided by small businesses. That's our workforce, right? Safety, street safety. We're talking about safety. You want Jane Jacobs comes to mind, So the sidewalk, the life, this is something that is so important, and yet we leave it disappear like that. We see one after the other, all sorts of important services and spaces disappear. So I think I talked too much. So we only have like 14 minutes, but sorry. Oh, I can't hear you. I don't know if others can hear you.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much. I think that this is also really kind of important, and we just scratched a little bit of the nitty-gritty. So I think we can also open it up immediately also for the questions. I will ask the first one, but please just type in your questions if you have There are so many things that I would like to ask you, Olympia. On this last part, I think I will just kind of reflect quickly is that this question of what is, the small shops and diversity of life they bring is really something that is an incredibly big issue, not just in New York, it's across. And the UK cities and towns and which is this kind of high street question here of wiping out anything other than the big corporate businesses is really something that is like we are already facing this, that also across the Europe, in which we are constantly just moving from one same corporation to another space. So I think that this is precise. And I remember 10 years ago when I was visiting a friend in New York and she was at work, she told me go to this bodega and pick up a key of my house. And so that's kind of a kind of attention to the ways in which the question of who gets to spend time and space without necessarily maximizing their profit is also how this kind of reach, how do we design for life? So my kind of first question is also, because we have here changing laws and kind of pushing for a city to make a new institution, claiming knowledge and expertise pushing into public. To which extent you understand all of this as design interventions?
Me? I didn't think they were design interventions.
But now, when you step a little bit outside,
I guess, I said it. I didn't plan to say it, but at a certain point today during my presentation, I said we are very good at asking questions.
Yeah.
And I think what you're taught in architecture school is also how do you frame a problem, right? So it's not obvious. How do you, when someone comes with a commission for you, a project, the first thing you need to do is understand what is the project, right? So question the framing of what it is that you need to do. And I think because of the complexity of urban development, very often there is no space for questions, right? The majority of the people are trying to get it done, and it is so hard to get it done, right? In fact, we're failing at providing basic things like enough housing for people. So you see the emergence of this very problematic, in my opinion, just built, like the trickle down solution is going to work, right? And that's where I believe the designer voice needs to come in, the perspective and the understanding of people who studied architecture and planning needs to be there, needs to say, no, but the questions need to be asked. There is a reason. We don't do that because we are NIMBYs. It's like the way in which, and I feel this has to do, of course, so much with the rise of fascism and shaming of, doing basic questions that help understand and reframe problems is seen as, oh no, you are not in my backyard, you are reactionary or whatever, where actually an acritical embrace of trickle-down, market-driven urban development that many people are trying to push down our throat would be a disaster, would continue, by the way, the problems that we currently experience, because what these, right-wing experts don't really say is the market was a driving force already, and that's what brought us here. So why do we believe if we further eliminate any kind of regulation and protection and, traditional, let's say, planning evaluation and design evaluation, that would resolve the problem that the market has already created? So I don't know if it answers your question.
No, I think it answers. And I think what I think is kind of incredibly important here is that it's those kind of the spatial design training we get help us see the connections between things that don't necessarily, either by design, are not being kind of met, that seen, but also that kind of by those who kind of maybe are in positions of power to see these connections. But I think that there are often that people who live their lives or manage their small businesses or try to carve the spaces for do-it-yourself culture, they don't, they are so focused on the everyday, so that it's hard for them to actually kind of, when confronted with such a big thing such as fire safety or all the different regulations, they are also just, this is incredibly scary tactic. And I think that what is really important, this kind of placing of discrimination as a spatial problem. And there is a question around this. But so I think that where this is really powerful of spatial designers is that we can understand unintended and intended consequences of different policies and practices in space, and we can intervene in advance. And I think it's precisely, and this question of who gets to sit at the table, the bridging that you've been thinking. And for me, this is profoundly design intervention as well, and not because, it's not because it's what you're also designing, is you're designing the context in which specific strategy, specific new community organized around certain issues can emerge. You bridge the gaps between various different actors and stakeholders, which the way that the kind of system is organized wants to keep them apart. And really importantly, you open up access to specialized knowledge so that people can claim it for themselves. So I will read the next question. Okay, so there are two questions already. So I'm going to read the first one and then the second one. So anonymous attendee says, thank you for your wonderful speech, Olympia. My question is how to intervene in the issue of discrimination from a spatial perspective. In fact, in some places, especially do-it-yourself spaces, there are indeed some so-called unsafe areas. People will avoid going to these places to some extent. So does this mean that do-it-yourself spaces have to be isolated again?
So I understand the last question, that is, does this mean that DIY need to be isolated? But what was it saying? There are some safe spaces?
Yes, I think that the way I understand the question is that it's like, there are in some so-called unsafe areas. I think that people will avoid going. So I think that it takes a specific, the same way in which high-end spaces.
No, I understand the question very well.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that when I was telling you about those, 100 ideas and then how we put them in those three umbrellas, that falls under the category, all three categories, basically, this question. And the people who create the spaces, very often it would be a collective, a group of people, sometimes one artist, and then the community would follow. They usually don't have means, right? They usually don't have access to major capital. And so that's why they often are in lower income neighborhoods, in warehouses, in areas that are less, I think the person who's asking the question said safe. But I think what makes us safe is us, like it's the community, right? So even though, and that's why a lot of these artists and collectives felt that they were doing a re-examination of themselves, and they felt that they were the worst kind of gentrifiers, because with them, with the community, with the DIY spaces, came the safety, and then came the capital and the development and the displacement. And that was sad. And that were the kind of thinking that we were doing also with the Office of Nightlife and the board and with all our advocacy of how do we break this cycle? Because we make us safe, right? And I also want to link this question to something you just said earlier that was about, community and how do we people are busy and they cannot understand and they have their priorities. How do we expect them to take a position? And the reality is, and we saw it, I think, to some extent in New York with the latest, election, is the moment you find the right way to speak to what people need, people will show up. And not only will show up, but will also do the work. So I think we can reshape a lot of the forces that shape our environment by being present, by choosing the right battles that will allow us to, preserve what needs to be preserved and change what needs to be changed. So I don't think that DIY spaces need to be isolated, or are isolated. I believe that actually these are the spaces that I found to be much more connected and network, both in terms of the communities that they serve in different ways, but also between them. So there is an ecosystem. And so I think the question for the people who are part of the ecosystem, but also for people who are decision makers, is how do we preserve and protect that? And that has been all our advocacy, protection and preservation of these very important areas of community and creativity.
And I think what is also is that like people should not be afraid of better services coming to their neighborhoods, because they understand that this will be their their end of being in those neighborhoods. And I think that what here has becomes really important to think about, and what is this kind of capacity to actually understand knock-on effects of certain things, and that while one chooses a battle, there is never a single focus battle, because it's actually understanding and building kind of coalitions between different battles. And I think that the victory of Zora Mamdani really shows that people are actually that kind of not reducing complexity of issues, but understanding that there needs to be a simple entry point into the issues, such as affordability. And then affordability is such an important, like such an expansive concept when you think about it, because it's actually, we are trained to think about it in context of housing, as it needs to stop there. But we can, all of us can, especially through that, enter into thinking what is affordability, but then how we can push that further. And I think that this is really important. Okay, so we are now 1 minute before we are supposed to end. There are kind of 2 more questions, or like questions with another question, with a sub question and a follow-up question about do it yourself. So I'll just read them. But I also want to kind of keep the time for the last question I always want to ask, which is about music. Because like at the end, my understanding of minor planning, this has really been shaped a lot by recognizing how, for me, in the cities I felt I belong to, or I feel I belong to, like Niš, Belgrade, or now London. The path of belonging was often through being with others, and listening at the events we called concerts and parties, and by deep commitment to listening, as also kind of urban spatial knowledge. So, what is the music for you that you want to share that opens up city life collectively and otherwise? And I think that this is also so pertinent to the question of do-it-yourself spaces, and also because so much of the music we love that came out of New York would not be able to come out of New York today, because
our
these
advocacy
people.
Very often we talk about CBGBs and how it was uttered by doubling and tripling of the rent. Okay, so you had told me this question was gonna come, and I'm gonna give you the answer that I gave you when you told me, but
yeah,
with the prequel. So the prequel is one picture that didn't make it in my PowerPoint is that in the signing of the first legislation we were involved in, that was the Office of Nightlife, the establishment, the last surviving members of the Ramones, Marky Ramone, was there. So I would say, okay, listen to some Ramones today. But
yeah.
what I kind of like, my go-to music for a lot of the good vibes and the humor of how you need to tackle life, I guess, in cities is, Johnny Mitchell's Big Yellow Taxi. They paved paradise. And I think it's so, I just, that song is something that helps me recalibrate. It's an oldie.
No, it's yes, but I think that there is also a lot in this kind of old song, old music, oldish music, new music. They also often carries the atmosphere, spatial atmosphere, that we are also can also understand what we are losing. And I think that they are also really important reminder that our spatial imaginaries really have to be much richer. And to understand the design, especially if we think it on city design, especially if we think about it across beyond just formally shaping space, really has kind of can be also starting question like how do we commit to creating spaces and enabling them that they can kind of thrive over longer periods of time in an affordable, equitable way, so that this type of music that did not start by thinking how it can be the 15 seconds of Spotify algorithm will actually. So how do we transform and also allow new forms of life to emerge? I will read the questions that we didn't still address just to have them recorded, and there are two follow-ups to this conversation of do yourself. What would it take for participatory design process and not only be moved to move beyond consultation, but to become genuine configurative tools rather than merely reactionary or activist interventions that enable communities in Europe to proactively shape, protect, and sustain their own spaces, especially those who are most vulnerable to regulation, displacement, and market pressure. And I think that some of the processes that you've been initiating are actually these, because I think it was about producing people who were often producing individual people who would be attacked as a political subject in a group that then actually can push for. So I push for, because I think in that context, what you did is not only focus on individual people. There was a process of becoming a political collective subject.
I think these are great questions, and maybe we can have a conversation where we're going to be all together so they can ask the questions and we can have a back and forth. But I think a quick kind of opening of the answer is the best way to contribute meaningfully is to be there, right? So I think if you are students, what you need to do is just look around you and find what are the areas that are really of most interest to you, right? What people don't realize, but very often things that you wouldn't think are design or whatever, but that they use every day. I don't know, like the DIY space I had in mind when I went at that meeting was not a music venue. It was childcare. I had a 1-year-old and I needed to find daycare. And guess what? The only affordable one was a collective space where parents would chip in a basement of a church, and they had created this amazingly beautiful space for children, for daycare, nursing. So I think that my answer to that question, and we can continue the conversation in the future, is I think being part uh, and being thoughtful in asking questions, in understanding what is going on, then do the research. And that is the real research in terms of what are the processes, what are the means, what are the regulations that lay people don't understand how they are connected to what they experience as an issue, as a problem, right? And then come up with an answer together and be ready to stay in for the long way. An activist, I think she was the founder of the Central Park Conservancy before Central Park had become, the oligarchs' playground. Like when it was like originally saved as an incredibly beautiful civic space, she had worked endlessly, and she had said what saved her was the 3 P's: patience, passion, and perseverance. And it's terrible. I don't remember the name of that woman, but she was the person that I heard talking about those 3 P's. And I think if you want to do anything in the urban space, if you want to do anything that includes in a meaningful way communities, those three things are key.
This is absolutely amazing moment to finish this conversation. I think that there is another set of questions which are about the thinking about more than human participation, which informs the design, especially in the context of Mississippi Delta projects. I think that this is yet another really important question, especially in cities such as New York, and really biodiversity is inside of buildings is larger than biodiversity outside of the buildings. But I think this is for the next future conversations. Thank you so much, Olympia. This has been amazing. And thank you for showing us also the way to correlate that even in cities such as New York, there is a really strong ongoing fight to make it more equitable. And where would the world be if we would kind of use New York as an example? If New York becomes the leading example of affordability and equitability, and not just billionaires playground, which is really trying to become. So this kind of fight, and we have, I guess, a lot of people that are on this call share my enthusiasm to see what's going to happen from 1st of January.
We are hopeful.
Yes, and I think hope is a discipline, as Mariam Kaba, another great New Yorker, teaches us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. I have posted the link to the next conversation is next Thursdays with Khaldun Bassara. We are going to talk about repair and liberation in the context of Palestine. And then we will take a break for New Year's Eve and return in January.